Right, so I've been reading a bit in the last few months. I read a fair bit in general, but I want to talk about some of what I've been reading. Up first, I read Bookshops and Bonedust, which is the sort of prequel-esque thing to Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. And I really loved the book. Baldree manages to, so he writes about this very low-stakes, cozy fantasy vibes. And he manages to, in an otherwise seemingly benign setting, not use super complex plot structures or stakes or anything to get you invested, but instead uses really human interplay between the characters and shockingly just real interactions to get you invested. And you feel so deeply for these characters that are otherwise super fantastical and straight out of D&D handbook. And so I'd really recommend reading it, especially if you haven't read the first book as well. Read that too, Legends and Lattes. But I give it 4.5 stars. I also read Sunrise on the Reaping, which is the sequel to the prequels of the Hunger Games. Having read the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, I think it is, obviously that book's really sort of cool because you get a background into President Snow and it gives you a lot of context to the whole Hunger Games universe. And I wasn't so sure about, what a book focusing on Haymitch would be like, because realistically, he does a lot in the story, but he's not as involved in fleshing out the world, if you will. But I went into it still pretty interested because I found that Haymitch as a character is more compelling, especially the way Collins writes it. It's on the YA side, but there was never really a moment where you felt pulled out by some of the sort of common YA writing, I guess. There's also a really interesting sort of foreboding tone to the entire story because that at some point something pretty drastic has to happen for Haymitch to end up, the drunken wreck of a state that he's in at the start of the Hunger Games. And so you're kind of waiting for this pin to drop the whole time. And even knowing that, the end of the book was still an absolute sucker punch. So I really, really liked the book, and I'd give it probably 4 stars. The next thing that I read, these aren't in order or anything, but another thing that I read this month was The Power. So it's for a book club that I'm part of. And as a result, I knew the least about The Power. And what Naomi Alderman writes about is you have this world where she explores the idea where you flip sort of your power dynamic on its head by sort of exploring a world where women have this, awaken this ability to cause an electric current through physical contact. And I found the book really, really fascinating. As someone who's a large male, the way that I interface with the world is very influenced by that fact. And so I thought that Naomi did a really cool way, sort of explored the idea of what would change if that situation was to change in the world really in an interesting way. And I also found the foreword and postword, another word for that, postword of the book, really fascinating. Commentary, in-world commentary about the story itself, which called to sort of front of my mind unconscious biases I was having whilst reading it that I wasn't even aware of. So really, really appreciated the book, and I'd give it 4 stars as well. I also reread this month The Will of the Many, classic book by James Islington. He also wrote the Lycanius trilogy, which is pretty well known, but I think it took him those 3 books to get into his stride for The Will of the Many. It runs the risk of being a little bit tropey in terms of, there's an orphaned child from a royal family who gets whisked away and is running the run and then gets adopted into this other family and enters a war school and is super gifted and talented, chosen one, yada, 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 right? So it sounds super troped, right? But I think that Islington is able to really lean into some of the gory aspects of the story and that it doesn't become a YA book in any sort of field to me. I mean, obviously, a young adult could read it, but at least I found that the intensity in some of the scenes was really refreshing, and also the characterization's fantastic. And also, if you haven't read it, go read it. 5 stars. I think this is my 4th or 5th time reading it. Really recommend it. And the sequel to it, which is coming out, I believe, in November this year. So great time, or December this year. Great time to get reading it now. Final thing I read this month was The Training Game by Gary Stevenson. It's an autobiographical work where he was one of the most successful Citibank traders for a little bit in the late noughties, early 2010s from memory. I read this book because it was highly recommended by a few mates of mine who are sort of more on the businessy side. And it's the only thing that I've read in nonfiction for a while. All in all, I thought the book was really great. Stevenson either worked with some really funny people or has caricatured some of the people that he worked with into these very interesting personalities on the page. And so it's an entertaining read in that point. Although I was a bit disappointed in whenever he is talking into the actual trading side of things, it was so simplified that it felt almost condescending, reading through the examples or the piece-by-piece way that he explained everything without going into any of the strategy that he used for his trading or really what made him so successful, in my opinion. And so for that, I think if you want to have a pretty light autobiography, because it is a fun read, it is pretty funny, or don't know anything about the scene of trading and want a very light introduction to that, it probably could be a good read, but for me, I'd probably only give it 3 stars. And I haven't read all those in the last month. I read some other things as well, but that's the ones that I kind of had the most to talk about, I guess, in this setting, or wanted to remember in the future. Some other things I'm reading at the moment, partway through in various aspects. One is called Lust for Life, which is the largely fictional biography of Vincent van Gogh. And it's really, really fascinating. I love Van Gogh's works, and so it's been cool exploring this colourful interpretation of what his life was like. They based loosely off some of the letters that do actually exist, trying to get into a mind state that might have produced some of his works. I'm about halfway through. I've been reading little bits of it as I go, but we'll get through to the end of that. I'm also reading Hogfather by Terry Pratchett, which if you've read anything by Pratchett, it's kind of impossible to try to turn his work into a synopsis. There's no real way to explain the Hogfather that I can think of, so I won't. But I haven't picked it up for a few weeks, but we'll get through to the end of that as well. I'm also part of the way through Gatsby. I'm realistically not going to finish Gatsby. The whole book is written as a lithogram, whatever it is when you have a specific limitation on your writing. So in Gatsby, they don't use the letter E, just for the hell of it. It's surprisingly easy to read, even though the prose is slightly different. Like, you can still get through it pretty comfortably. It's just also a bit old, and so it's a bit slower to read, not as simple, I guess. And the final thing I'm reading at the moment is Caliban's War, which is the second of the Expanse series coming after Leviathan's Wake by James Corey. It's pretty good. I tried picking up The Expanse a few years ago and just put it down in the first book, but I've been told that it sort of gets better and better through the fourth book, and then, after that's really good as well. So I'm giving it my best shot at the start of the second book. We'll try to smash through, just see how much of the series that I can get into for now. Finally, some books that I was on the list that I've got, but I need to actually start getting into. Probably a little bit optimistic. It's Journey to the West, which is a piece of classical Chinese literature written in the 16th century, I believe. And the reason it's sort of optimistic more than anything else is because it's 4 volumes, each with more than 500 pages. It's a huge book. So that's one that I'll sort of tackle over the coming year, if anything. On that route as well, as I'm also reading The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is another piece of ancient Chinese literature, even older, but it follows China in the sort of hundreds to 280 AD, I believe it was, when the reunification of China happened then. And it's sort of a fictional retelling of that historical period from when they wrote it in the 1400s. And then the final 2 things I'd say that are on my list is Exhalations, which is a collection of stories, I believe, by Ted Chiang. I don't know much about it. It was recommended by a friend. Science fiction-y, exploration into academia and that pursuit of knowledge vibe. It looks pretty interesting, so I figured I'd read it. And then also, final book is Onyx Storm. I read the first 2, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, when they came out, and really liked them. But I've been putting off Onyx Storm, even though it came out earlier this year, just because I thought it was only going to be a trilogy, but now it's going to be a pentology or whatever 5-book series are called. And I just find the drip feeding of romance series really tiring. And so I've not had the motivation to get into it, but I will finish it sort of in the coming months, hopefully. But yeah, that's what I'm reading. If you've got any recommendations, please, I don't know, get them to me. I'll probably not end up reading most of these books and read other things anyway, but that's the plan.